The sky over Boston was so blue it almost hurt to look at. In the summer of 1941, Fenway Park wasn't just a stadium, it was a sanctuary where myths were written, a coliseum testing the limits of human potential. Stepping into the batter's box was a man named Ted Williams. He was only 23. Yet, the aura he projected overwhelmed even the most seasoned veterans. As dust kicked up in the box, he dug in his spikes and held his bat high. When the white ball left the pitcher's hand, snake biting through the air, it seemed as if Ted's eyes could read the very spin of the seams. Crack! A crisp explosion tore through the Boston air. The ball soared over the right field fence, plunging deep into the stands. A 406 batting average. It was the moment an immortal record, one that would likely never be seen again in baseball history, was sealed. The crowd rose as one, chanting his name. Ted, Ted, our hero. He didn't tip his cap. He simply ran the bases, stoic and unreadable. But deep inside, a pride as hot as magma was boiling. He was America's pride, a final gift of romance to a nation about to plunge into the fires of World War II. No one knew. No one could have guessed that this man, shining like the sun, strong and unbreakable, would one day end up trapped in a cold metal cylinder against his will, denied his eternal sleep. Time is a cruel wizard. Eternal youth fades in an instant, and bodies of steel crumble helplessly before the winds of time. Turn the clock forward 60 years to 2002, a hospital room in Florida. In a space sharp with the smell of antiseptic, an old man lies still. An IV drip is stuck into a gaunt, skeletal arm. EKG patches clutter his chest. This is the legendary hitter, Ted Williams. The dynamic vision that once tracked blazing fastballs is now clouded by cataracts, barely able to distinguish faces. A stroke has robbed him of his movement, locking him in the small prison of a hospital bed. His lungs have hardened, making every breath impossible without a ventilator. He was exhausted. Glory, cheers, honor, he felt in his bones how meaningless these were in the face of death. He wanted only one thing: rest. Whenever his mind cleared, he would hold the hand of his eldest daughter, Bobby Jo, and plead with her. Bobby Jo, when I die, burn me. Cremate my body and scatter me in the deep blue waters of Florida. I just want to be the wind. I want to become the waves and swim freely. In December 1996, he had clearly signed his last will and testament. I, Ted Williams, express my desire to be cremated. It was his final dignity as a human being, a desperate wish to return to the earth according to nature's law. He did not want his body stuffed and mounted as a spectacle. He simply wanted to put a period at the end of his sentence as an ordinary man. But outside the hospital room, in the dim hallway, a man with eyes as cold as a snake was pacing. Ted's youngest son, John Henry Williams. He inherited the great father's genes, but not the talent. He failed as a baseball player and failed as a businessman. The only job he ever held was, Ted Williams's son, selling his father's autographed balls, managing image rights, and living off the scraps of a legend. To John Henry, his father wasn't a person to respect. He was a walking corporation, an inexhaustible ATM. Now, that ATM was about to break down. The moment his father's heart stopped, the lifeline supporting John Henry's lavish lifestyle would be cut. John Henry bit his nails anxiously. Cremation? If we scatter the ashes in the ocean, it's over. What's left? There's nothing left to sell. Then, a word whispered through his mind like a devil's temptation. Alcor Life Extension Foundation. A bizarre facility in the middle of the Arizona desert. A place selling the technology of cryonics, freezing the dead to revive them in a distant future where medicine has advanced. Greed glinted in John Henry's eyes. That's it. We freeze him. The first major league hitter to be cryogenically frozen. That alone will be massive news. And if he's revived in the future? Or even if he isn't, if we can preserve his DNA? We could sell that DNA. Maybe clone him. Make little Ted Williamses. It was a horrific plan to turn his father into an eternal product, masking it as science. He didn't care about his father's soul finding peace. Only money and a twisted desire to remain special dominated his brain. John Henry moved with calculation. He waited for the moment his father, weakened by strokes, lost his judgment. One day in 2000, the hospital room held only John Henry, his sister Claudia, and the frail, confused Ted Williams. John Henry pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It wasn't a formal legal document drafted by a lawyer. It was a scrap, maybe a napkin rolling around the hospital tray, maybe a torn memo pad. There was even a mysterious oil stain on it. John Henry forced a pen into his father's hand. "Dad, you remember this, right? It's our promise to stay together as a family forever. You just need to sign here." Here. Ted looked at his son with blurry eyes. Could he even read what was on the paper? He simply did as his son asked, leaving a shaky, worm-like scrawl on the page. That scrap of paper read, "I, Ted Williams, along with my son John Henry and daughter Claudia, agree to be put into biostasis after death." The so-called family pact. No one knew that this single, oil-stained piece of paper of dubious legal standing would become the chain that locked the legendary, billion-dollar body into a tank of liquid nitrogen. John Henry tucked the paper deep into his pocket like a treasure map, smiling a fishy, triumphant smile. Now it's done. Dad is mine forever. Completely unaware of this, the eldest daughter, Bobby Jo, was preparing for the funeral. She was looking into beautiful coastal spots in Florida, calmly waiting for the day she could return her father to nature, just as he wished. To her, her father wasn't just a hero, he was a man who loved fishing and the sea. She believed that protecting his final dignity was her duty as a daughter. But the air inside the hospital room grew heavier. John Henry began to control access. Using the excuse that their father was in critical condition, he even blocked Bobby Jo from visiting. Behind the scenes, he was secretly communicating with the Alcor Foundation in Arizona, booking the flight to transport the body and reserving the cryocapsule. Like a hyena waiting for its prey to fall, John Henry was waiting for the exact moment his father's heart stopped beating. The July sun of 2002 was burning hot, but a chilling frost had already settled over Ted Williams's hospital room. Soon, the body-snatching operation that would shock the world was about to begin. The baseball god who could not close his eyes even in death, and the ugly war of the living over his remains. The curtain was rising on the tragedy. The year was 2000. While the Florida sun still baked the earth outside, the hospital room where Ted Williams lay was as cold and dry as deep winter. The curtains were drawn tight, as if forbidding even a single ray of light from entering. In that darkness, the man once called a god of the diamond lay buried in his bed, like an old machine struggling just to breathe. His consciousness drifted in and out like the tide. The strokes had scrambled the pieces of his memory, and his heart beat so precariously it seemed it might stop at any moment. On that day, the person who opened the door wasn't a doctor, nor a nurse. It was his son, John Henry Williams. There was no hesitation in his steps. It wasn't the walk of a son concerned for his father. It was the stealthy, swift movement of a predator moving in for the kill. In his hand, instead of a briefcase, he held a single, crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a crisp legal document from a law firm. It looked like something torn hastily from a notebook, or perhaps a napkin that had been rolling around a restaurant table. In the corner, a yellowish oil stain had spread, and over it, frantic pen marks were clearly visible. It was less a document and more a scribble. But in John Henry's eyes, that paper looked like a ticket to heaven, or rather, a guaranteed check for eternal wealth. He leaned close to his sleeping father's ear and whispered low. Ted struggled to lift his heavy eyelids. His son's face shimmered before him. Even through vision clouded white by cataracts, his son's eyes shone with a piercing intensity. It was greed. "Dad, you remember, right? That we'd be together forever. A dream where the family never parts, meeting again in the distant future to play baseball together. To make that dream come true, you just need to sign here." John Henry whispered softly, persistently, as if casting a hypnotic spell. He dug relentlessly into the cracks of his father's fading judgment. Ted was confused. Together. Family. Those words were a sweet temptation to a lonely, sick old man. For someone who had fought solitary battles in the world of competition his whole life. The phrase, "together with family forever," might have sounded like undeniable comfort. But Ted's instincts, that wild intuition that once roamed the outfield, were screaming that something was wrong. He had wanted to live his life as a natural man. He wished for death to turn him into a handful of ash, scattered in the blue waters of Florida, to flow freely with the waves and wind. That was the unchanging belief he had clearly hammered into his 1996 will. "John, I want to go to the ocean." Ted squeezed the words out in a raspy voice. But John Henry let them slide right past his ears. He forced a ballpoint pen into his father's skeletal hand. Then, he pressed the tip to the signature line on the paper. "Dad, the ocean is too cold and lonely. Science will protect you. Here, just write your name. Trust me, I'm your son. I'm your son." That one phrase crumbled Ted's final resistance. Is it true that no parent can win against their child? Or had his soul, worn down by illness, simply given up the fight? Ted's hand began to tremble. Regardless of his will, the pen tip, guided by his son's hand, slid across the paper. Scritch, scratch. The ink blotted as the signature was carved onto the oil-stained paper. It was the moment the great name, Ted Williams, was reduced to cryonic test subject number 1. John Henry snatched up the signed paper. A fishy smile spread across his lips. He scanned the text on the paper once more. Family pact. I, Ted Williams, along with my son John Henry and daughter Claudia, agree to be put into biostasis after death. A sentence too crude and flimsy to hold legal weight. A single scrap of paper with no notary seal, no witness signatures. No one could have imagined that this dirty piece of paper, stained with grease, would become the strongest shackle binding a legend's corpse in the future. John Henry christened this paper his father's latest will. It was logic that made no sense in the legal world, but common sense didn't matter to him. All that mattered was that this paper was the only pass that could send his father to the nitrogen tanks of the Alcor Foundation. With a satisfied expression, he shoved the paper deep into the inside pocket of his suit. Like a devil pocketing a stolen soul. Ted, on the bed, drifted back into a deep coma. Never dreaming of what he had just done, or the horrific fate his body would soon face. The secret didn't last long. As her father's condition worsened, his eldest daughter, Bobby Jo, rushed to the hospital. She had been preparing for the funeral just as her father had always wanted. She was looking into crematoriums and boats to scatter his ashes at sea. But the atmosphere in the hospital was strange. The medical staff avoided Bobby Jo's questions, and John Henry was busy making phone calls, as if hiding something. "John, how are the funeral preparations going? Did you book the crematorium like it says in the will?" At Bobby Jo's question, John Henry scoffed. "Cremation? Sis, what era are we living in? Dad doesn't want to disappear in such a primitive way. What are you talking about? Dad always said he wanted to go to the ocean, even in his '96 will." "That's old thinking. Dad changed his mind. Look at this." John Henry pulled the questionable, oil-stained note from his inner pocket and waved it in front of Bobby Jo's eyes. She doubted her own eyes. Crooked handwriting on a crumpled napkin scrap. It was definitely her father's handwriting, but clearly written when he wasn't in his right mind. Cryo. Preservation? Bio. What? Bobby Jo's lips trembled. It was absurd, absolutely preposterous. "John, are you crazy? You want to freeze Dad? Is he a fish? You're going to put him in a freezer?" Shouting erupted, echoing loudly down the hospital corridor. Passing nurses looked on in shock, but the siblings' fight didn't stop. "You don't understand, sis. This is science. When future technology advances, Dad will wake up again. If we preserve his brain cells, his memories and personality will stay alive. Don't you want to see Dad stand in the batter's box at Fenway Park again?" John Henry's eyes glinted with madness. He seemed to genuinely believe this delusion. No, he wanted to believe it. Only if his father returned could his own parasitic life be extended. Bobby Jo felt suffocated by the rising anger. Cut the crap. Bring him back for what? To sell more signed balls? To use his name for business again? Please, just let him go. He lived his whole life trapped in the public eye. In death, at least, he should be free. How can a son try to lock his parent in a cold tin can? I'm telling you, this is Dad's will. His signature is right here. You forced that on him. You tricked a sick old man to get a fake signature. I will never accept this. I'll go to court. You are not taking Dad's body. Court? Ha. Don't you know the most recently written document holds legal power? This napkin is his latest will. John Henry laughed despicably and put the napkin back in his pocket. Bobby Jo wanted to collapse right there. The fact that this man in front of her was her brother, that they shared the same blood, felt horrific. Did Ted, inside the room, hear this commotion? Perhaps he did. But he had no strength to open his eyes, no strength to move his lips. Only a single tear pooled in the corner of his eye and flowed helplessly down his wrinkled cheek. It was a father's tears of blood watching his children fight, and a sorrowful mourning for his own approaching fate. The night deepened. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the hospital, the confrontation between a son blinded by greed and a daughter trying to protect dignity ran parallel, never to meet. And in between them, the life of a great legend was slipping away like sand in an hourglass. Soon, when his heart stops, the body transport operation, planned by John Henry, will begin. Before Bobby Joe can even make a move, the tragedy has already been conceived and is racing toward catastrophe. July 5, 2002, 8:49 a.m. In a Florida hospital room, the blaring alarm of the life support machine ceased, and the heart monitor displayed only an endless, flat line. The god of baseball, the legend of the .406 average, Ted Williams, had finally ended his 83-year journey and returned to the arms of the divine. His soul must have been ready to shed its rotting flesh and soar freely over the blue waters of Florida he so desired. But that freedom was only momentary. In the eyes of his son, John Henry, who stood by his dying father, there was no sadness, only the gleam of a predator spotting its prey. Instead of closing his father's eyes or offering a prayer of mourning, he pulled out his cell phone. "Dad's gone. Start now. We have no time." It wasn't the voice of a grieving son discussing funeral arrangements. It was the command to launch a meticulously planned military operation. John Henry knew. He knew that from the moment his father's death was announced until his sister, Bobby Joe, could file a court injunction to stop the disposal of the body, he had only a few hours. The body was barely cold. Yet, the private ambulance team hired by John Henry stormed into the hospital room. Instead of respectfully preparing Ted's body, they wrapped it in thick plastic, as if handling a fish at a market, and ruthlessly dumped piles of ice packs over it. "Lower the temperature. The cells can't die. Faster. Get more ice." John Henry's shouting filled the room. On the final journey of a great hero, not a single chrysanthemum was laid. Only the stench of cold ice blocks and preservatives filled the air. The ambulance carrying the body sped away from the hospital without sirens. Its destination wasn't a funeral home. It was a small airfield in Florida. On the runway, a private jet was already waiting with its engines warm. On its tail, a strange logo was emblazoned, like a symbol for those defying death. Alcor Life Extension Foundation. Ted's body was loaded into the cargo hold like luggage. Amidst the white vapor of dry ice, he was no longer the human Ted Williams, but merely frozen cargo known by the code name, Patient A. 1949. The plane roared down the runway and took to the sky. As it flew toward the scorching deserts of Arizona in the west, it felt as if Ted's soul was chasing after it, screaming in agony. When his daughter, Bobby Joe, arrived at the hospital sobbing after hearing the news, her father's body was already flying above the clouds. It was clearly a body snatching, a kidnapping. Scottsdale, Arizona. Under the blazing sun, the Alcor Foundation building stood like a fortress. When the doors to the underground lab opened, a grotesque scene unfolded, like something out of a science fiction movie. Under pale fluorescent lights, giant stainless steel cylinders gleamed like a forest of metal. Inside these liquid nitrogen tanks, called dewars, countless people were already frozen solid, hanging upside down, waiting for a future that might never come. Technicians in white coats moved busily. There was no reverence or fear in their eyes. Just a sample that had arrived to be processed. Ted's body was placed on the operating table. Tubes were inserted into his stiffening veins. Start the pump. Begin blood washout. As the machine hummed to life, the red blood remaining in Ted's body began to drain out. In its place, a glycerol-based, cryoprotectant, antifreeze was pumped in. This chemical, something you might put in a car radiator, flowed through the hero's veins and spread throughout his body. They called it vitrification, a process to prevent cells from being destroyed by ice crystals, but it was a horrific ritual of pickling a corpse in chemicals. But the true horror was just beginning. The option John Henry had chosen wasn't whole-body preservation. It was neuroseparation, which he believed to be cheaper and more efficient. John Henry's logic was simple and cruel. The body is old and diseased. Future technology can clone a new one. What matters is Dad's brain. As long as we have the head with his memories and personality, Dad can live again. The air in the operating room grew heavy. The surgeon picked up a power saw. The sound of the sharp blade spinning broke the silence. Whir whir, a sight too terrible to watch unfolded. The noble neck of the greatest hitter in baseball history. The neck that had looked up to the sky as he hit countless home runs, was forever separated from his torso on that cold operating table. The severed head underwent another gruesome treatment. Holes were drilled into the skull, and chemicals were injected directly to ensure the antifreeze permeated deep into the brain. And finally, Ted's head was placed into a small stainless steel canister. Sealed like a can of tuna, the canister slowly, very slowly, sank into a tank of boiling liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees Celsius -320 F. Watching the canister disappear into the cold nitrogen mist, did John Henry smile with satisfaction? Now Dad lives forever, and I gain eternal wealth. But there was no eternity there. Only severance. Severance from his beloved daughter, severance from his wish to return to nature, and a complete severance from his final dignity as a human being. What happened to Ted's headless torso? According to Alcor records, the body was also stored separately in cryostasis. But dark rumors circulated that it was used for research or only partially preserved. Either way, he was no longer a whole person. Trapped within cold metal walls, destined to sleep an eternal, dreamless sleep in pitch-black darkness. The world did not yet know this horrific truth. But secrets, like rotting corpses, eventually start to smell. Soon, a shocking revelation would burst forth from within the Alcor Foundation, from an employee stricken by conscience. That revelation would be grotesque and tragic enough to make all of America want to vomit. In the summer of 2002, a shockwave tore through America. The news that the body of the last 406 hitter, Ted Williams, had been cryogenically frozen was sensational enough. But the revelation that his head had been severed during the process sent the entire nation into a spiral of horror. They beheaded the god of baseball. This is a clear desecration of a corpse. Is the son trying to sell his father's head? Front pages were plastered daily with stories of Ted's severed head. Fans were enraged. Crowds gathered in front of Fenway Park to mourn Ted and condemn John Henry. They held pickets reading, "Return Ted to nature," and "Punish the greedy son," pouring out their indignation. But John Henry didn't blink an eye. He already held his father's inheritance and was hiding behind the sturdy shield of the Alcor Foundation. In press interviews, he spoke shamelessly. "This is what my father wanted. He wanted to live forever. Why is it a crime to wait for the day science can wake him up?" Unable to bear it any longer, the eldest daughter, Bobby Jo, filed a lawsuit. "Give me my father back. Get him out of that horrible lab." The legal battle was fierce. Bobby Jo's lawyer presented the formal will Ted had written in 1996 as evidence. This will clearly states cremation. Ted wanted to return to nature his whole life. The grease-stained napkin scrap John Henry presents as a fabrication. A line of Ted's old friends and caregivers stood on the witness stand. They testified in unison. Ted loved fishing. He always said, "When I die, I want to be ashes scattered in the Florida waters." Even on his sickbed, whenever he had the chance, he begged Bobby Jo, "Burn me." But John Henry's legal team was cunning. They countered by placing the controversial "family pact" note on the bench. "Your Honor, a will can change at any time." This document was written in 2000, making it the most recent. Ted only revealed his desire for eternal life when death was imminent. This is a private matter that only the family could know. The judge looked troubled. Legally, the principle of "latest document prevails" applied, but the authenticity of that document was highly suspicious. However, John Henry had poured his massive inheritance into hiring the best legal team, relentlessly exploiting every loophole in the law. One day, as the tedious lawsuit dragged on, an event occurred that shook the courtroom. Larry Johnson, a former employee of the Alcor Foundation, stepped forward as a whistleblower. His revelation was grotesque beyond imagination. "Your Honor, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what I saw there wasn't science. It was a slaughterhouse." Larry Johnson testified with a trembling voice. "It was when Ted Williams's head was being put into the canister. The staff accidentally dropped the canister. As it cracked, hairline fractures appeared on Ted's head too." The courtroom filled with screams and gasps. But the revelation didn't stop there. The staff were giggling. One employee even played with Ted's severed head. He tapped the canister with a wrench, like opening a tuna can, and shouted, "Home run." Sounds of retching erupted from the gallery. Bobby Jo covered her ears and sobbed. The dignity of a great hero had been shattered. There, only a mutilated body and devils who treated it like a toy existed. Public opinion boiled over at this revelation, but the yardstick of the law was cold. Desecrating a corpse is morally reprehensible, but since the body had been donated, it was difficult to punish under the guise of research purposes. The lawsuit lasted nearly a year. Bobby Jo poured her entire fortune of $130,000 into restoring her father's honor. She sold her house and fell into debt. But her opponent was John Henry, who held millions of dollars of their father's inheritance. He bought time, and he bought the law with money. December 2002, just before Christmas. Bobby Jo walked into her lawyer's office with an empty bank account and an exhausted body and soul. Her eyes were hollow, her voice cracked. "I I'm stopping now." The lawyer asked in surprise, "Bobby, if you give up now, your father will never come back." "Just a little longer. I know. But I have no strength left to fight. No money, no hope. My brother won. That devil won." Bobby Joe stamped the withdrawal papers. Her hand trembled violently with anger and sorrow. "John, you won. I hope you're happy now that you have Dad. But you lost your soul. You will live in hellfire for the rest of your life." Her scream echoed hollowly in the courtroom ceiling. John Henry left the court with a triumphant smile. But he didn't know that victory was the countdown hastening his own destruction. With the lawsuit withdrawn, Ted Williams's body became the permanent property of the Alcor Foundation. His head, cracked and with brain cells destroyed, was locked deep inside a cold liquid nitrogen tank. He is no longer Ted. He is Alcor's Subject A 1949. The blue ocean, the free wind, and the warm sunshine he dreamed of are in a place he can never reach. He became a prisoner in a -196-degree jail, a hostage to his son's vain delusion. This incredible tragedy asks us, who owns the body after death? Is it the will of the deceased, or the desire of the living? Is this cruel act performed in the name of science truly life extension, or is it corpse violation? Now the story races toward the final chapter. John Henry, the son who froze his father and was intoxicated with victory. What fate awaits him? Karma. They say heaven's net is wide, but it lets nothing slip through. In 2003, John Henry Williams felt like he was standing on top of the world. The tedious legal battle was over, and his sister Bobby Joe had admitted defeat and retreated. His father Ted Williams's body was safely stored in Alcor's tank, and the business plan using his father's DNA was proceeding smoothly. "I'll make little Ted Williamses with Dad's DNA. Buying the genes of a baseball genius. That's an experience you can't buy even with a fortune." He believed he had obtained the golden goose that would exploit his father's fame forever. But he had overlooked something. God never overlooks human arrogance. Heaven handed him a bill. It was a bill to be paid not with money, but with life. One day, less than a year after the lawsuit ended, John Henry felt extreme fatigue. He thought it was just business stress. But the bleeding in his gums wouldn't stop when he brushed his teeth, and his sturdy frame lost weight by the day. The doctor gave him a diagnosis he couldn't believe. "It's acute myeloid leukemia. I'm sorry. It's progressing too fast." It was too cruel for a twist of fate. The son who cut off his father's head and locked him in a cold nitrogen bin for the sake of his father's eternal life. Now, his own life was flickering dangerously like a candle in the wind. John Henry screamed, "This makes no sense. I just got everything. Dad's inheritance, the business, it's just starting, and I'm dying." He struggled to live. He poured his father's money into finding the best medical team and endured harsh chemotherapy. He even underwent a bone marrow transplant from his sister Claudia. But the disease would not let him go. Was it the price for damaging his father's dignity? The cancer cells spread like wildfire in his blood. March 6, 2004. In a hospital room in California, John Henry Williams was gasping for breath. He was only 35. It had been less than 2 years since he forcibly froze his father. Even in the face of the terror of death, he did not let go of his obsession. "Send me. To Dad, it wasn't a tear of repentance. It was an attachment to the delusion that he, like his father, could wake up again someday, refusing to acknowledge death until the end. Even at the last moment, he refused cremation or burial. He, too, chose freezing. As soon as John Henry took his last breath, the exact same thing he had done to his father 2 years prior happened to him. His body was quickly covered in ice and transported to the Alcor Foundation in Arizona. And he, too, was filled with cold antifreeze on the operating table. Now, at the Alcor Life Extension Foundation in Scottsdale, Arizona. In the underground vault, thoroughly cut off from the outside world, only a chill lingers. Huge silver stainless steel tanks stand there like tombstones. In one of those tanks, inside that pitch-black darkness, there are 2 men. The father, Ted Williams, who was called the God of Baseball. And the son, John Henry Williams, who froze his father and then froze himself. They are hanging upside down in liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees Celsius -320 F. The father and son, who were entangled in desire and love-hate while alive, have begun a grotesque cohabitation, locked within cold metal walls, never to be separated in death. Was this the family being together forever they wanted? Or is it the most terrible and cold punishment sent by God? What are they thinking as they face each other? Do memories of regret remain in their frozen brain cells? The seasons have turned, and spring has come again. The cheers of baseball fans still echo at Fenway Park in Boston. The statue of Ted Williams standing at the stadium entrance looks down on children with a bat on his shoulder, looking dignified. People take photos in front of the statue and talk about the legend. That's the last 406 hitter. He was truly a great hero. But the hero they remember is only a statue made of bronze. The real Ted Williams spends an endless winter in a desert bunker, his head separated from his body. This incredible story asks us a chilling and heavy question. Human desire to defy death. Does resurrection wait at the end of it, or an eternally unending prison? Can damaging a parent's final dignity out of a child's greed truly be called love? The father who wanted to be the wind. The son who stuffed that father, dreaming of eternity. And the cold nitrogen tank that swallowed them both. The Ted Williams cryonics scandal. This will remain in history as the most bizarre and sad self-portrait of the 21st century, created by modern science and human greed. Please, I hope only warmth fills the homes of everyone listening to this story right now. Do not forget that true love, which even death cannot tear apart, is not preserving a frozen body, but leaving a warm memory in each other's hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of Ted Williams you just witnessed. Doesn't the end of a hero, trapped in a cold metal can do to his son's twisted desire, feel incredibly chilling and painful? Human greed, trying to defy death, ultimately created an eternal prison. But here is a different story. In stark contrast to this horrific tragedy of freezing, there is a giant in South Korea, who stood at the highest peak but walked down to the lowest place on his own into the warm embrace of the earth. In Korean society, it was customary for the heads of conglomerates' chaebols to be buried in massive tombs, erecting large tombstones to create a sanctuary. This is the story of the late chairman Bon-moo of LG, who broke that rigid custom and offered his body as fertilizer beneath a single tree. If Ted Williams is suffering as a stuffed idol, Chairman Bon-moo remains by our side as a living forest. His final retreat, returning to nature without burdening his children, and thus gaining true eternal life. I invite you to witness this beautiful and unconventional scene in Korea. Behind the Twin Towers in Yeouido, Seoul, there is a modest gomtang beef bone soup restaurant. Amidst the office workers in ties bustling during lunch hour, a middle-aged gentleman sits quietly, unnoticed. He wears a simple outfit, not an expensive designer suit, and his shoes are worn at the soles. He is Bon-moo, the chairman of LG Group. Watching him finish a bowl of soup alone without a secretary, one could find no trace of the authority of a conglomerate head who moves tens of billions of dollars. He always said, "People come first. Technology and money are ultimately for people." To him, harmony among people in Wa was not just a company motto but a philosophy of life. He mingled with employees without reserve and laughed simply like a neighbor. But in moments deciding the group's future, he was a colder and more decisive strategist than anyone. In 2017, news struck like a bolt from the blue. Brain tumor. The disease had taken root so deeply that surgery was already difficult. In a room at Seoul National University Hospital, overlooking Namsan Tower, Chairman Koo sensed that his life was nearing its end. Even during his painful battle with the disease, he remained composed. And quietly, very quietly, he began to prepare for his end. A conviction he had held all his life hovered in his mind. Empty formalities and vanity. He detested the Korean social disease of saving face and showing off more than anyone. "I want the path of my departure to be as simple as the path I have lived." He called his son, Executive Director Koo Kwang-mo. A heavy silence filled the hospital room. Chairman Koo's voice was quiet, but its resonance was as heavy as a mountain. "Kwang-mo, my funeral. Keep it quiet." "Yes, father. We will hold a family funeral." "No, I mean, do not bury me." Koo Kwang-mo doubted his ears. In the LG family, where Confucian traditions are strong and the principle of primogeniture is strictly observed, choosing a method other than burial was unimaginable. All the previous chairmen were laid to rest in magnificent graveyards. "Cremate me. And bury the ashes under a tree." "Do you mean a tree burial, natural burial?" "Yes. Do not erect a tombstone. Do not make a grand grave. Do not let the living suffer to honor me. It is enough for me to return to the soil and become fertilizer for a tree." This was not just a simple will. It was a quiet revolution overturning the landscape of Korea's chaebol funeral culture. It was the exact opposite path of Ted Williams's son, whose desire tried to hold onto his father even by freezing him. Chairman Koo declared non-possession, giving up even his body to nature without regret. When this will became known, opposition from the family elders was fierce. "Chairman, what are you saying? We must honor you so that we are not ashamed before others. LG has a reputation to uphold. How can we lay you to rest under a tree without a proper grave? Where will the descendants go to bow? Without a grave, it is like losing our ancestor." But Chairman Koo's will was firm. What is reputation? Is it filial piety to torment the living for the sake of the dead? "I want to go my own way." If you respect me, please grant my last request." He persistently persuaded his family. Seeing him unyielding in his philosophy even before death, the family eventually had to bow their heads. May 20, 2018. Chairman Bon-moo passed away at the age of 73. His funeral was held strictly as a private family funeral, as he requested. There were no thousands of funeral wreaths that usually appear at a chaebol head's funeral. Nor were there long lines of mourners from the political and business worlds. Only a notice was posted at the mortuary: "We respectfully decline flowers and condolence visits." Only immediate family members gathered to quietly mourn the deceased. Instead of loud wailing, the music the deceased enjoyed in life played softly. It was not a funeral, but a time of warm farewell. Seoul Memorial Park Crematorium. Usually, attendants would line up and reporters would flock, but this day was different. Chairman Koo's hearse entered quietly, mixed with the hearses of ordinary citizens. There was no special treatment, no cutting in line. Chairman Koo came out as a handful of ash. His urn headed to a mountain near Gonjiam, to Wadam Forest. Wadam Harmony Talk. Meaning, to share a friendly conversation, it was the forest he cherished and loved most in life. In a sunny spot in Wadam Forest, an old maple tree stands. Chairman Koo's ashes were quietly buried in the soil, a span deep, next to the tree's roots. There was no burial mound. No boundary stones. Not even a common tombstone was erected. Only a small marker, the size of an adult's palm, was placed under the tree. The third LG Chairman Koo Bon-moo. That was all. No fancy modifiers, no epitaph praising his achievements. Thus, he became part of the forest he had cultivated all his life. He became a maple tree that blooms in spring, provides shade in summer, and turns red in autumn, silently speaking to those who visit. Ladies and gentlemen, close your eyes for a moment and recall the ends of these two men. Ted Williams, trapped in a cold nitrogen tank, sleeping a sleep that never breaks, with his head separated from his body. Where is his soul wandering now? Is he happy, imprisoned by his son's greed? On the other hand, Chairman Koo Bon-moo, embraced by the warm earth, becoming fertilizer for a tree. He must be traveling the world freely now, becoming the wind brushing through the forest, becoming the song of birds. Who gained eternal life? Who gained true immortality? What Chairman Koo Bon-moo left us is not just the global company LG. Through his death, he sounded a wake-up call to the vanity and burial culture prevalent in our society. Death is not the end, but a return to nature. Leaving no burden to children is the last love a parent can give. He came empty-handed and left empty-handed. But his beautiful retreat remains in our hearts as a giant tree that will never be erased. Ladies and gentlemen, we too will leave someday. What do we want to leave to our children then? Is it a cold epitaph, or the scent of a warm forest? Will you make your children sweat and complain while mowing the grave every holiday? Or will you let them eat lunchboxes like a picnic under the shade of a tree, reminiscing, thanks to grandfather and grandmother, we smile like this? Chairman Koo Bon-moo's decision for a tree burial asks us living today not just how to die, but how to be remembered. I'm here to make sure your love story doesn't end in a legal tragedy. I'm attorney Yoon Kim, and I'll be with you every step of the way. Thank you for watching.